I came home one evening to find my privacy hedges butchered and a $750 fine stuck to my front door. It was a yellow notice that read, "Vegetation violation corrected. $750 landscaping fee applied to your account. Willow Creek HOA." My heart raced as I stared at the stumps of what had once been 6 years of careful growing and weekly trimming. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. My beloved hedges, my personal privacy shield, had been reduced to a mere 3 feet in height. I grabbed my measuring tape and checked. Exactly 3 feet. The HOA's regulations allowed hedges up to 7 feet, and mine had been 6.5 feet. I measured them every Saturday morning, following the rules down to the last inch. Someone had trespassed on my property and destroyed my barrier for no reason. I stormed inside and dialed the HOA office, barely able to contain my anger. "Willow Creek Gardens, HOA, this is Margaret speaking," came the voice on the other end. "Margaret, this is Jackson Taylor from 243 Magnolia Drive. I just came home to find my hedges butchered and a $750 fine on my door." "Who authorized this and why?" I demanded, my voice trembling with frustration. "One moment, Mr. Taylor," she said. The sound of typing followed. "Yes, we received several complaints about visibility issues with your hedges. The board voted on it last Thursday. Didn't you read the community email?" "What email?" I shot back, my confusion growing. "I never received any notice, and my hedges were within regulation height. I measure them weekly." Margaret's tone shifted, colder now. "The board determined your hedges exceeded height restrictions and blocked sight lines at the corner. The decision was unanimous." "That's impossible. I want to speak to Karen Wilson right now," I demanded, my voice rising. "The board president is unavailable," Margaret replied curtly. "You can file a formal appeal, but the landscaping fee stands. The work has already been done." I hung up, my mind racing. This wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. They had no right to enter my property without proper notice. I grabbed my camera and rushed outside to document the damage. As I took photos of the mangled remains of my hedges, I saw a sleek black SUV slow in front of my house. Karen Wilson, the HOA board president, rolled down her window, flashing a sickly sweet smile. "Landscaping looks much better now, Jackson," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "The whole neighborhood thanks you for finally complying with regulations." "I was already in compliance, Karen," I replied sharply, my anger flaring. "This was trespassing and destruction of property." Karen's smile never wavered. "The board has authority to remedy violations after proper notification. Check your email next time," she said dismissively, rolling up her window. I wasn't about to let it go. "You targeted me specifically," I called out, my voice rising, "just like you did to the Montgomerys last month with their fence." Her window stopped halfway as she turned back to me. "Be careful with accusations, Jackson. This community runs on rules and respect. Some people just have trouble with both," she said coldly, before driving off. I stood there seething with rage, but something else stirred inside me. An idea. An idea that had never crossed my mind before. That night I received an unexpected email. It was a job confirmation for the following Monday. My new position as the financial auditor for Willow Creek Gardens HOA. The board had approved my hiring the previous week, but the paperwork wouldn't reach Karen until tomorrow. They had no idea. No idea that I had been given full access to their financial records, spending logs, decision logs, and everything for the past 5 years. I smiled for the first time since coming home. Karen thought she had all the power, but she had just handed me the keys to her kingdom. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My eyes kept drifting to the gaps in my once pristine hedges, now mere stumps and shredded branches. It wasn't just the destruction of my property. It was the sheer audacity of the Willow Creek HOA. This wasn't just about the hedges. It was about control, manipulation, and secrets. I spent the morning pacing around my house, wondering what had really been happening behind closed doors at the HOA. What else had they been hiding? I was about to find out. After breakfast, I gathered my things and headed out the door. My first stop was the county records office. I had a feeling the HOA had no legal right to be on my property without proper notification, and I wasn't going to leave it at just that. I needed to confirm if they had any easement rights, any authority at all to trespass on my land. The clerk, an older woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, raised an eyebrow when I requested the property boundary maps and easement records for Willow Creek Gardens. Doing some home improvements, and she asked, sliding a heavy binder across the counter. More like solving a mystery, I replied, opening to the section that included my street. I flipped through the pages quickly, scanning the boundary lines and easement notations. When I saw what I was looking for, my heart sank. The HOA had no easement rights to my property beyond the standard utility access points, which were nowhere near my hedges. What they had done, what Karen had done, was straight-up trespassing. There was no legal justification for entering my property and destroying my hedges. But that wasn't all. As I continued flipping through the maps, another discovery caught my eye. The landscaping company listed on my violation notice, Elite Green Solutions, had filed business registration paperwork just 3 months ago. The owner's name was Michael Wilson. The name sounded familiar. I snapped a photo of the registration and then quickly searched the business listings on my phone. Sure enough, the name Wilson matched Karen's last name. Karen Wilson's brother-in-law owned the company that had been hired to correct my vegetation violation. I couldn't believe it. The company that had destroyed my hedges was tied to Karen's family. I needed more answers, and I needed them fast. Next, I headed across the street to Diane Reynolds' house. Diane had always been a thorn in my side. She was the one who had complained about my hedges blocking her view at every neighborhood meeting. I knew she'd be home, and this was the perfect opportunity to confront her. When Diane opened the door, her smile dropped as she saw me standing there. "Jackson, what a surprise," she said, her voice tight with discomfort. "Good morning, Diane," I said, forcing a smile. "Those sprinklers are looking mighty active for a drought restriction day." She glanced nervously at her yard, where the sprinklers were indeed running, despite the county's odd-even water restrictions. "Just a quick sprinkle for the new flowers," Diane mumbled, trying to brush it off. "Funny how some violations get overlooked while others get immediate action," I said, my tone sharp. "Like my hedges that were cut yesterday. I wonder if you know anything about the complaints the HOA mentioned." Diane's face flushed, and she looked like she was trying to figure out how to handle the situation. "Well, those hedges were blocking the view of the intersection. Safety hazard," she said quickly. But I could tell it didn't sit right with her. "That's interesting since my property isn't on an intersection," I replied, raising an eyebrow. "It's mid-block, and the sightline maps I checked at the county office show no visibility issues." She shifted uncomfortably, but I wasn't done. "Karen said she'd take care of it without any formal complaint process or notification to me. That's against HOA bylaws." Diane bit her lip and started to close the door. "You should talk to Karen about that," she muttered, just before shutting it with a quiet thud. I stood there staring at the closed door. It was clear now. Karen had orchestrated the entire thing with Diane's help. But there was still more to uncover. Much more. I spent the next 3 hours walking around the neighborhood, documenting every rule violation I could find with my camera. The HOA had turned a blind eye to violations committed by board members and their friends while punishing anyone else who dared to step out of line. Karen's oversized gazebo, Rob Johnson's unpermitted fence, the Bradford's commercial vehicles parked overnight, everything was a violation, but no one had dared to enforce the rules against Karen's inner circle. As I documented these violations, I couldn't help but feel a sense of power. I was no longer just the frustrated homeowner. I was armed with evidence. Evidence that would take down the corruption in Willow Creek Gardens. I was done being the victim. Now I was going to expose the truth. Just as I was finishing up, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up. Karen's black SUV. She rolled down the window, flashing me a cold, calculating smile. "Taking up a new hobby, Jackson?" she asked sweetly, but her eyes were icy. "Just admiring the neighborhood," I replied calmly. "Lots of interesting exceptions to the rules around here." Karen's smile didn't waver. "Neighbors who work together tend to find reasonable compromises. Those who cause trouble tend to face more scrutiny." "Is that a threat, Karen?" I asked, my voice steady. "Just an observation," she said coolly. "The board meeting is tonight. Feel free to file your complaint. We have a special form for chronic complainers." The SUV sped off, but not before Karen's last words echoed in my mind. We have a special form for chronic complainers. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just a bully. She was desperate, and desperation was a sign of weakness. I smiled to myself as I walked back inside, the weight of the evidence in my hands. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter in Willow Creek Gardens. The HOA had messed with the wrong homeowner, and they didn't even know it yet. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was moving faster than I could keep up with. I had uncovered enough to tear apart the Willow Creek HOA's house of cards, but there was still so much to do. I knew this wasn't going to be a quick fight. Karen Wilson wouldn't just roll over. If anything, she'd double down, and that terrified me. But at least now I had the upper hand. I started my day with a quick breakfast, then drove straight to the county clerk's office. I needed to gather more evidence, this time about the HOA's finances. My gut told me something bigger was at play, something tied directly to the HOA's budget and spending practices. If I was going to take them down, I needed the smoking gun. The clerk who had helped me the day before, Mrs. Sanderson, smiled at me when I walked in. "Back for more property records, Mr. Taylor?" she asked with a knowing look. "Actually, I'm here for something a bit different today," I replied. "I'm looking for records on the HOA's financial transactions, particularly any contracts with landscaping companies." Mrs. Sanderson raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Landscaping, huh? Well, I don't have those on hand, but I can give you the vendor files. They're public records, so it won't be a problem." She handed me a thick binder, and I set to work. As I flipped through the documents, I felt a growing sense of dread. There, among the invoices and transaction records, were payments to Elite Green Solutions, over $200,000 in the past year alone. The very same company that had been hired to cut down my hedges. I narrowed my eyes at the numbers. The payments were inconsistent, inflated, and made under the guise of emergency vegetation management. There was no way they could justify these charges, especially considering how little work had actually been done. And then it hit me. The payments were too high, far beyond what any legitimate landscaping company would charge. This wasn't just about cutting my hedges. This was a systemic issue. I took photos of the records, my fingers trembling with excitement. I had what I needed. The next stop was a familiar one, Karen's house. I wasn't going to confront her directly today. Instead, I needed a different angle. I knew Karen was a control freak, and she was always watching. I'd seen her eyes narrowing when I'd walked past her house earlier, but this time, I had a plan. I knocked on Diane's door again. This time, she didn't try to slam it in my face. She opened it reluctantly, peeking her head out. "What do you want now, Jackson?" she asked, her voice tight. "I have some questions about your involvement with Karen," I said calmly. "You wouldn't mind answering them, would you?" Diane looked uncomfortable, but I could see she was weakening. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Come on, Diane. You're the one who started all of this. You complained about my hedges, right? And then Karen took care of it for you," I pressed, holding my ground. "But the funny thing is, my property isn't on an intersection, and the county's sightline maps show no visibility issues. So tell me, what exactly did Karen promise you in exchange for your complaint?" Diane's eyes darted to the side, and for a moment I thought she might slam the door in my face again. But instead, she stepped back and let me inside. The silence between us was thick with tension. "I didn't think it would get this far, Jackson," she admitted finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Karen said she'd take care of it, said the hedges were a safety hazard, but all she did was fix things so she could make more money through her brother-in-law's landscaping company. I didn't think anyone would notice. So you sold me out," I said quietly. "And now she's playing you too." Diane nodded slowly. "She's been doing it for years, using the HOA to get money for herself and her family. I didn't know about all the other things until recently, but once I saw the invoices, I knew I'd been taken for a fool." I sat down across from her, feeling the weight of everything she was saying. "Do you want to help me stop her?" Diane hesitated but finally nodded. "What can I do?" I smiled. "We're going to need to gather more people who are willing to stand up to her. The truth is on our side, but we need evidence, and we need more than just her word against ours." Diane agreed to help, and we spent the next few hours going over the records I had gathered and making a plan for how we could approach the other neighbors. We would need witnesses, and we would need their support in the upcoming board meeting. As we parted ways, Diane's demeanor had changed. She was no longer the smug neighbor who had always been on Karen's side. She was someone who had seen the truth and was ready to do something about it. Later that day, I found myself at the Riverside Park. I hadn't planned on meeting anyone there, but I needed to clear my head. As I walked along the path, I spotted Thomas Garcia, the lone board member who had occasionally opposed Karen's decisions. He was sitting on a bench, staring at the water, looking more tired than usual. I walked over to him and sat down without saying anything. Thomas looked at me, his face etched with worry. "Jackson, you're really diving into this, aren't you?" "I have to," I replied quietly. "Karen's been running the show for too long, and the HOA is a mess. I found more than just inflated landscaping invoices. She's been siphoning money from the community for years." Thomas didn't look surprised. "I figured as much, but I didn't have any proof. The problem is, Karen has a lot of power. She controls the board, and she knows how to keep people quiet." "I'm not scared of her," I said, my voice steady. "She messed with the wrong homeowner." Thomas nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I'll back you up, Jackson. I can't do it alone, but if we can get enough people behind us, we might stand a chance." The storm was coming. Karen had no idea that I was already on her trail, and now with Thomas on my side and more neighbors waking up to the truth, the battle had only just begun. The next HOA meeting was set for tomorrow night. I knew that would be my chance. I had everything I needed: the financial records, the evidence of selective enforcement, and the support of my neighbors. It was time to confront Karen head-on. I walked back home that evening, my mind racing. Tomorrow would be the beginning of a new chapter, not just for me, but for the entire Willow Creek Gardens community. The time had come to expose the corruption, and there was no turning back. The day of the board meeting arrived, and the air in Willow Creek Gardens felt heavy with anticipation. I had spent the morning organizing my evidence, double-checking every financial record, and preparing the presentation that would expose Karen Wilson for what she truly was. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. This was it, my chance to take down the corrupt HOA and free the neighborhood from her stranglehold. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., but as I arrived at the community center at 6:45, I could already see that this was going to be different. The parking lot was packed, a stark contrast to the usual sparse attendance. Word had clearly gotten out. Neighbors had started talking, and now they were showing up in full force. I parked my car and walked toward the entrance, my nerves firing on all cylinders. I could see the board members milling around inside, exchanging hushed words. Karen was standing near the podium, scanning the room with her cold, calculating gaze. She didn't see me at first, but I could feel her eyes narrowing when she caught sight of me through the glass doors. I took a deep breath, straightened my tie, and entered the building. The room hummed with quiet chatter. Residents filled every folding chair, with more standing along the walls. As I walked toward the front row, I noticed some people nodding at me, a few offering small smiles. They had heard the rumors, and they were eager to hear what I had to say. But the tension was palpable. Everyone knew tonight wasn't going to be just another typical board meeting. I found my seat and connected my laptop to the projector. I kept my cool, my hands steady, despite the racing thoughts in my head. Karen was at the head of the table, her perfect blonde bob shimmering under the fluorescent lights, her smile tight and rehearsed. At exactly 7 o'clock, Karen tapped the microphone, her rings catching the light as she adjusted it. She cleared her throat and the room went silent. "Welcome, everyone," Karen began, her voice honey-sweet but laced with steel. "Before we begin official business, I'd like to address a serious situation regarding our new financial auditor, Jackson Taylor." The room felt quiet as all eyes turned to me. My heart hammered against my chest, but I didn't flinch. "Mr. Taylor has been making unfounded accusations and misusing his position to pursue a personal grudge after receiving a standard violation notice." She glanced at me, her smile thin. "The board will be voting tonight to terminate his contract immediately to protect our community's financial security." I stood up, the remote control for the projector in my hand. "Actually, Karen," I said, my voice steady, "I'd like to present my preliminary audit findings to the community directly." Karen's smile faltered for just a moment before she quickly recovered. This isn't on the agenda, Mr. Taylor. Sit down or I'll have you removed. I raised the HOA bylaws booklet, holding it up for the room to see. Actually, Karen, Article 7, Section 3 of the bylaws states that any resident may present relevant financial information at public meetings. I felt a wave of satisfaction as I pressed the button on the remote, and the first slide appeared. It was a photo of my destroyed hedges, the stumps barely recognizable as the beautiful privacy barrier they once were. Many of you know what happened to my property last week, I said, my voice calm and even. What you don't know is why. I clicked to the next slide, revealing a screenshot of emails between Karen and Margaret, the HOA office administrator. This is an email where Karen specifically ordered action against my property, despite compliance reports showing my hedges were within the 6.5-foot height regulation. I continued. She disregarded the rules and acted without notifying me, just as she's done with other homeowners. Karen lurched forward, reaching for the projector cord. These are private communications, Jackson. You have no right to— I have every right, I interjected firmly. As the HOA Auditor, I am authorized to review all communications related to enforcement actions. I moved to the next slide, which showed a breakdown of landscaping expenses over the past 3 years. The numbers were staggering. Elite Green Solutions, the company owned by Karen's brother-in-law, had received over $500,000 in payments from the HOA. And who owns Elite Green Solutions? I asked, clicking to the next slide. Michael Wilson, Karen's brother-in-law. Gas rippled through the room as I displayed the business registration documents. That's a lie, Karen shouted, her face turning red. This is slander. I've done nothing wrong. I calmly responded, it's public record, Karen, and what you've done is misuse HOA funds for personal gain. I clicked to a neighborhood map, showing a clear pattern of violations. Green dots represented properties belonging to board members or their friends, while red dots marked the homes of regular residents. The green-dotted homes had no violations, while the red-dotted homes were hit with fines for even the smallest infractions. I've reviewed 3 years of violation record, I continued, and the pattern is unmistakable. If you're friends with the board, your violations magically disappear. If you question the board, like I did at last month's meeting, you suddenly get hit with multiple fines. The room was now filled with murmurs, and some of the residents were nodding in agreement. The evidence was undeniable. I clicked to the next slide, revealing a graph showing the HOA reserve fund's dramatic decline. Our emergency reserves had shrunk by 40% in just 2 years, with no major improvements to justify the spending. Now, I know this isn't just about my hedges, I said, my voice unwavering. It's about the money. Karen has been funneling HOA fees into her family's pockets, and she's been using her position to cover it up. But that ends tonight. Karen stood up, slamming her hands on the table. This meeting is adjourned. We will address these fabricated concerns at a later date, after proper review. But Thomas Garcia, the one board member who had always challenged Karen, stood up as well, his voice cutting through the chaos. Point of order, he shouted, raising his hand. The meeting cannot be adjourned without a vote. There was a tense silence before Thomas continued. I motion to continue the meeting and vote for an independent forensic audit of all HOA finances for the past 5 years. The room erupted in support. Hands shot up, residents voicing their approval. I second the motion, a voice from the back of the room called out. Karen's face drained of color as she watched the votes come in. She was losing control of the room, and she knew it. Motion passes, Thomas declared, his voice firm. The board will arrange for an independent auditor to conduct a complete forensic audit of the HOA's finances. Karen's face was twisted in fury. She grabbed the gavel and slammed it onto the table. You'll regret this, Jackson, she hissed. This is my neighborhood. I built it. I can tear you down just as easily as those stupid hedges. I stood tall, my gaze unwavering. No, Karen, you've taken from this community for 15 years. There's a difference. As Karen stormed out of the room, Thomas turned to me, a grin spreading across his face. You did it, Jackson. The community's with you now. I looked around the room at the residents who had once been too afraid to speak out, now standing up and applauding. We had won, not just a battle, but a war, And for the first time since I moved to Willow Creek Gardens, I felt a sense of hope for the future. The next chapter was about to begin, and it wasn't just mine, it was the neighborhood's. The days that followed the board meeting were a whirlwind. Word spread like wildfire through Willow Creek Gardens. The meeting had been the talk of the town, and I could feel the shift in the air. People had finally seen the truth, and they were rallying behind it. The independent audit was officially underway, and the forensic accountants had been brought in to sift through every financial transaction of the HOA for the past 5 years. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I had no doubt that the results would be explosive. Karen and the board members who had backed her were in for a rude awakening. For now, though, I had to stay focused. I couldn't let my guard down. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat quietly, and I knew that, even though she was on the losing side, she'd do everything in her power to maintain control. The next week was filled with strange occurrences. My neighbors started approaching me with stories of their own, stories about violations they'd faced, fines they'd received for the smallest things, and how the board had never once enforced rules against certain people. It was becoming clear that I wasn't the only one who'd been targeted by Karen and her cronies. But there was something else happening, something that chilled me to the bone. Karen wasn't just sitting back and accepting defeat. She was planning her next move. I could feel it in the way she walked past my house, her eyes steely and determined. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. One afternoon, as I was sitting in my living room, sorting through some of the documents I'd gathered, I saw her black SUV slowly drive past. I didn't think much of it at first, until the car stopped right in front of my house. The window rolled down and Karen's voice called out from inside. "Jackson," she said, her tone sickeningly sweet. "I just wanted to stop by and remind you that you're crossing a line here. The board isn't going to let you get away with this." I stepped out onto my porch, forcing myself to remain calm. "What do you want, Karen?" She smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Just wanted to make sure you're aware that there are consequences to your actions. You've gone too far this time, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. People don't like a troublemaker, Jackson." I could see it in her eyes. She was threatening me, but I wasn't going to back down. "I'm not afraid of you, Karen," I said, my voice steady. "You've been using this neighborhood for your own gain for far too long, and now it's time for the truth to come out." Karen's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white. "This isn't over, Jackson. Mark my words, I will make sure you regret this." Before I could respond, she sped off, the tires screeching as she turned the corner. I stood there watching the dust settle. Her threats didn't faze me. What bothered me was the way she said it. There was something in her voice, something that hinted at a deeper, more dangerous plan. She wasn't finished, and I had no idea what she was capable of. The next morning, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Thomas Garcia, the only board member who had always questioned Karen's decisions. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the neighborhood as he approached my front door. "Jackson," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for anyone who might be watching. "We need to talk." I motioned for him to come inside, my mind racing. What could be so urgent? "I don't know how to say this," Thomas began, his voice low, "but I've been hearing rumors. Things aren't as simple as they seem." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a sense of dread settle in my stomach. Thomas hesitated before continuing. "Karen's not just trying to save face. She's making moves behind the scenes. I've seen her talking to people from outside the neighborhood, people with connections. She's got a lot of influence, more than I ever realized. She's already making plans to push back against the audit." I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. "What are you saying, Thomas?" "I think she's planning something big. She's been calling emergency board meetings, ones that aren't even on the books. And the word is she's trying to find a way to discredit the audit, to make it look like a personal vendetta. I wouldn't put it past her to fabricate evidence or to try to sabotage it." I was silent for a moment, trying to process what he was saying. "So she's going to try to take down the audit before it can expose everything?" "Exactly. And if she can't do that, she'll do everything in her power to make sure you're the one who ends up blamed for the mess. She's not going to let this go." I felt a knot form in my stomach. Karen had always been manipulative, but now she was playing with fire. I needed to act fast, but how could I fight someone with so many connections? Thank you for telling me this, Thomas, I said, trying to stay calm. But we need to get ahead of her. We need to make sure the audit stays on track, and we need to expose her before she can do any more damage. Thomas nodded, his face grim. I'll do what I can. But we need to be careful. Karen won't hesitate to pull out every trick in the book to stop this. That night, as I sat in front of my laptop reviewing the audit materials, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant anymore. She was a woman cornered, and that made her dangerous. The next morning, I received an email that made my blood run cold. It was a message from the HOA's management company confirming that they had scheduled an emergency meeting for the following day. The email was vague, but the tone was clear. Karen was making her move. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let her get away with it. I gathered all the documents, printed out everything I could find that proved her corruption, and prepared to take the fight to the next level. It was time to end this once and for all. Karen had been running the show for too long, and now it was my turn to expose her for good. The next day I woke up early, the weight of the situation pressing down on me like a heavy fog. I knew Karen was making her move. The emergency meeting was just a few hours away, and I had to be ready. If Karen was going to play dirty, I had to make sure that I wasn't just reacting. I had to be proactive. She wasn't going to take me down without a fight. I spent the morning reviewing my evidence one last time. The audit findings were clear. Karen had been siphoning funds from the HOA for years, funneling money into her brother-in-law's landscaping company, inflating invoices, and using her position for personal gain. I had the proof, but now I needed to be strategic about how I presented it. I couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Around noon, I got a text from Thomas. He'd been quiet for a while, so when I saw his name pop up on my phone, I immediately opened the message. Thomas. Jackson, they've got their final move plan. The meeting today, Karen's calling it a special session to discuss internal audits, but it's just a cover-up. She's bringing in her lawyer to try to scare you off. Be prepared. My heart skipped a beat. A lawyer? This was getting worse than I thought. I quickly texted back. Me. What can I do? Thomas. We need to stay calm. Don't let her intimidate you, and don't let her silence the community. We have the numbers on our side. If we all speak up, we can't be ignored. I nodded to myself, even though Thomas couldn't see it. This was it. The community was behind me. I wasn't alone in this fight. I packed up my laptop and printed out the final set of documents. I had to be ready to present everything. Nothing could slip through the cracks. I was going to bring the truth to light, and I wasn't going to let Karen manipulate the situation one last time. By 6:30 p.m., I was walking into the community center, my heart pounding in my chest. As I entered, the usual crowd of neighbors was already there, some sitting, others standing by the doors, whispering among themselves. The atmosphere was tense but different. This time, the energy felt charged, like everyone knew what was coming, and they were all ready to face it together. I scanned the room and saw Thomas sitting toward the front, his hands clasped together, his eyes focused. He gave me a small nod when he saw me, as if to say, "We've got this." The board members were already seated, their faces a mix of arrogance and anxiety. Karen was at the head of the table, as expected. She shot me a cold glance as I made my way to the front, her eyes narrowing with irritation. But this time I wasn't intimidated. I walked up to the podium and plugged in my laptop, connecting it to the projector. Karen's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man sitting beside her, raised an eyebrow when he saw the evidence I was about to present. I could feel the tension in the room growing thicker. The board members were clearly expecting Karen to take control of the situation, but tonight it wasn't going to be her show. At exactly 7 p.m., Karen tapped the gavel and called the meeting to order. "Welcome," she began, her voice smooth but strained, "to this special session of the Willow Creek Gardens HOA. Tonight, we'll be discussing the results of our internal audit and addressing concerns raised by certain members of the community." She shot me a venomous look as she spoke. "Jackson Taylor, our new financial auditor, has accused the board of misappropriating funds and abusing power. These accusations are baseless, and we are here to clear up any misunderstandings." I stood up, the room falling silent. I didn't wait for her to continue. I pressed the remote control, and the first slide popped up on the projector. This is not about misunderstandings, Karen, I began, my voice firm. This is about transparency. This is about the truth, which you've been hiding for years. The first slide was a photo of the damage to my hedges, the same one I had shown at the last meeting. Last week, my property was unlawfully trespassed upon. My hedges, which were within HOA regulations, were destroyed, and I was slapped with a $750 fine. Why? Because I dared to question the HOA's practices. I clicked to the next slide, showing the email exchanges between Karen and Margaret, the board administrator. This is the email where Karen herself ordered action against my property, despite reports showing my hedges were in compliance. There was no formal complaint process, no warning, just an immediate fine and destruction of my property. I moved to the next slide, displaying the financial records showing over $500,000 in payments to Elite Green Solutions. And here is where it gets worse. Over the last few years, Elite Green Solutions, Karen's brother-in-law's company, has received more than $500,000 in landscaping contracts. These rates are inflated, far beyond what any reasonable landscaping company would charge, and the work done is subpar. The room was silent, all eyes on me as I continued. Elite Green Solutions has been overcharging the HOA, while Karen has been using her position to funnel funds into her family's pockets. But it doesn't stop there. I've also found evidence of selective enforcement. Properties owned by board members and their friends are never fined, but regular homeowners like myself are penalized at every turn. I looked directly at Karen as I clicked to the next slide, a map of the neighborhood showing the pattern of violations. Here's the proof. Green dots represent properties that belong to board members and their friends. Red dots represent everyone else. You can see the stark contrast in how violations are handled. Karen was seething now, her hands shaking on the table. She was trying to keep her composure, but the cracks were showing. I've done the work to uncover the truth, Karen, I said, my voice steady. And now, everyone here knows what you've been doing. I moved to the next slide. It showed a graph of the HOA's declining reserve funds, with a sharp drop over the past 2 years. The HOA reserve funds have been mismanaged, with over 40% of the money drained without any explanation. Where has that money gone? Karen's lawyer stood up abruptly. Objection. This is irrelevant, and it's a blatant attempt to discredit my client. We're here to discuss the audit, not baseless accusations. I turned to him unfazed. The audit is about the community's finances. This is exactly what we need to be discussing. The tension in the room was palpable as more residents began to speak up, sharing their own experiences with Karen's selective enforcement and manipulation of HOA rules. Thomas was right there, backing me up, speaking out against Karen's corruption. And soon it wasn't just me against her, it was the entire community. The room erupted into shouts with residents demanding answers. Karen's lawyer stood, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The truth had already come out, and the people of Willow Creek Gardens weren't going to let her sweep it under the rug. I motioned to call for an independent forensic audit of the HOA's financial records, Thomas said, standing up. We need to investigate everything, every payment, every decision. This board cannot be trusted. The vote was called, and before Karen could even protest, hands shot up all around the room. The motion passed. The board had lost. Karen had lost. As the meeting adjourned, Karen's face was pale, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She stormed out of the room, her high heels clicking sharply on the floor. But this time, there was no sense of victory in her stride. The community had spoken, and Karen's reign over Willow Creek Gardens was over. I stood there looking around at the people who had supported me, the ones who had finally found their voices. We had done it. We had taken back control. I smiled to myself, a sense of peace settling over me. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like we were on the winning side, and I wasn't about to let Karen or anyone else take that away. The days following the board meeting felt like a dream. For the first time since moving to Willow Creek Gardens, the neighborhood seemed to have shaken off the grip of fear that Karen had imposed for so many years. The independent forensic audit was moving forward, and the truth about Karen's corruption was slowly unraveling in the public eye. The community was no longer silent. It was united, and that unity made all the difference. Within a week, Karen had packed up her things and moved out of Willow Creek Gardens. It was hard to feel sympathy for her, knowing what she had done to the people here, but there was something bittersweet about watching her go. She had once been a figure of authority and power, but now she was just another failed tyrant. Her schemes had been exposed, her influence shattered, and the community she had tried so hard to control was finally free. The forensic audit revealed more than I could have imagined. The inflated invoices, the kickbacks to Elite Green Solutions, and the selective enforcement were just the tip of the iceberg. There were hidden funds, falsified records, and even instances where Karen had signed contracts without the approval of the rest of the board. It was clear that she had been using the HOA as her personal ATM for years. As the audit concluded and the findings were made public, the community took action. New board members were elected, residents who genuinely cared about Willow Creek Gardens and its future. Karen's associates, who had been complicit in her schemes, were removed from positions of power, and new bylaws were put in place to ensure transparency and accountability. The residents had learned a valuable lesson from all of this. They could no longer allow their community to be controlled by a few individuals with their own agendas. It was time for everyone to have a voice. I didn't want to be the hero in this story. I just wanted to do what was right. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the true victory wasn't just about taking down Karen. It was about the change in the neighborhood, the shift in mindset. People who had been too afraid to speak up now understood the power they held. They had learned that standing up for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against you, could bring about real change. I spent the next few months working closely with the new board, helping to rebuild Willow Creek Gardens. It wasn't easy, but it was rewarding. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood started to feel like a community again. People were genuinely looking out for each other, and trust, which had been eroded under Karen's leadership, began to return. The biggest lesson from all of this wasn't just about uncovering corruption. It was about the importance of standing up to injustice, no matter how powerful or untouchable the perpetrator might seem. It wasn't about me being the one to expose Karen. It was about the collective action of a community coming together to demand fairness, transparency, and integrity. Sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even if it means going up against the system, even when you don't know how things will turn out. But with patience, persistence, and the support of the right people, change is possible. And when that change comes, it feels more powerful than anything else. Willow Creek Gardens was never going to be the same, and neither was I. Lesson from the story. The story teaches us that standing up to injustice is not only important, but it's also necessary for the health of any community. Whether you're fighting against a corrupt system, an individual abusing their power, or simply standing up for what is right, the most crucial step is to find the courage to act. But even more than that, the story shows that change can't be achieved alone. It takes the collective strength of a community. When people come together, support one another, and demand accountability, they can bring about meaningful, lasting change. The lesson here is clear. The fight for justice may be difficult, but it is always worth it.